Egypt Petroleum Show.
Welcome everyone to this very interesting panel discussion on defining the steps for success to support and finance the growth of Egypt's oil and gas industry, where we will be speaking about the different energy projects that are being implemented in the country, and with the main focus on the funding mechanisms that are needed for those projects. We'll also be speaking about the financing options that are available for the project expansions, as well as the new refineries and the petrochemicals complexes as well that are undergoing development here in the country. And to talk to us a little bit more about that topic and shed more light on that, we're very delighted to be joined by Walid Labadi, who is the International Finance Corporation's country manager for Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Welcome.
Thank you, Linda.
We're also very delighted to be joined by Hiba Abdellatif, who is the head of debt capital markets at the Commercial International Bank, CIB. Welcome. We're also very delighted to be joined by Ahmed Murtada, who is the Energy Sector Associate Banker at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome, Ahmed. We're also very delighted to be joined by Youssef Bishay, who is the Senior Banker at BNP Paribas. Welcome, Youssef. Now, let me start off first, dear panelists, with a question that I would like to ask all of you about. Now, how promising do you find investing in the Egyptian oil and gas industry? And we'll start with you, Mr. Walid.
How long? Sorry? Yeah.
How promising do you find investing in the Egyptian industry?
Sure. So maybe just a word about IFC. So IFC is the private sector part of the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group is focused on reducing extreme poverty and promoting sustainable development, and the energy sector is an important part of that. What IFC has done historically in the energy sector and in the oil and gas sector in particular in Egypt is we focused on upstream and midstream and downstream with chemicals. So on the upstream side, we did focus in the past on upstream development of finding and developing assets, and we were part of a number of revolving borrowing-based facilities and reserve-based lending. We also are involved with a number of chemical projects. In terms of where we see the future, I think we see the future in midstream and downstream. We think that a lot of the liberalization that has happened in the gas sector is very promising in terms of attracting private sector investment. In the downstream, we're involved with a number of chemical factories, so we think maximizing value for downstream assets is very important. And we're generally optimistic. We think that the political program is very helpful in terms of creating the stability that will attract foreign investment. Reserve-based lending is a little bit down internationally. I think there is some concerns about that. I think some banks didn't do so well in the past when oil prices went down. So I think we'll need private equity to try to develop the upstream, and then on the midstream and the downstream, I think IFC's in a position to help partner with others to try to develop the sector. Thanks.
Hiba?
So CIB is the largest private sector bank. So we've been very, very active in the oil and gas sector, mainly in the mid and downstream. As Walid was saying, on the upstream financing, Egyptian banks have not classically had a lot of experience in reserve-based lending. So what we've been doing is a lot of petrochemicals and fertilizers. And I think the promising future for Egypt is in developing the midstream and the downstream. And that will, I think, mainly depend on, the findings of gas that have recently been discovered, and then sort of managing domestic demand and supply to enable there to be a surplus to be used for developing these projects. And I think we see a lot happening in terms of refinery upgrades, and I think that's one of the main focus of the Ministry of Petroleum, and that's where we think really the focus has to be for the coming period.
Thank you. Ahmed?
Hi, yes, I think the oil and gas sector in Egypt is a crucial industry that we are quite active in and we will continue to support. To us, the oil and gas sector, I mean, this is the backbone of the economy. You need fuel for the power stations, you need fuel for the car, you need it basically for the industries. We are quite active across the value chain, from upstream, midstream, and also a bit of downstream. In the upstream, we have a number of RBLs, so we're still working on RBLs, even though we had a rough couple of years, I have to say that, with regards to RBLs, so everyone's cautious about it now. In the midstream, we're actually working together with CIB and IFC. We're co-financing a big fuel terminal in Ain Sokhna. Sonker, exactly. This is also going to be a big success. And we're also involved in EBRD. I mean, we have the flexibility of working with the private sector and also lending to the public sector. So we have a sovereign loan with the Ministry of Petroleum, actually specifically with EGAS and GASCO for some energy efficiency investments on the gas transmission network, the compression and decompression stations. And we are about to sign a new sovereign loan for the Suez Oil Petroleum Company to upgrade the refinery. This is where actually we're active in the oil and gas space.
Yusuf?
Thank you. I would say why we like oil and gas in Egypt, because we think it's crisis-proof, and in the sense that the sector managed to weather a lot of domestic and external shocks, be it at the political turmoil in 2011 to 2013, but also the global shocks related to oil price deterioration and shortage of bank capital going to hydrocarbons. Now this bank capital is moving more towards sustainability, towards green finance, withdrawing slowly from shale, from coal and so on. And under this crisis-proof idea, I would say that three things have not really changed or have remained fairly stable in Egypt over the past 10 or maybe 50 years, which are good assets, good operators of different shapes and sizes, from oil majors to mid-sized juniors to local players who are growing abroad. And third is government support. And I think government support is a very important element, that it has provided a stable regulatory regime, isolated from the bureaucratic buildup of the Egyptian state. It has also managed to be more reactive to the conditions that Egypt faced over the past few years by changing gas prices in a lot of concession agreements, and this has triggered the renaissance that we are seeing today in terms of production. And the third element of government support is arrears management. And maybe this is a daring idea to throw at the opening question, but I think that further work and further deliberation should be allocated to this point by not necessarily talking about the level of arrears and if it increases or decreases, but having a more level playing field framework of managing these arrears and promoting transparency, especially to new investors who want to come in but still have some unclear ideas on how this topic is managed.
Now, thank you all. And let me begin with you, Ahmed. Yusuf. Sorry, Yusuf again. Now, when we speak about the different oil and gas projects in Egypt, we're speaking about the Zohr discovery or the Zohr gas field, which is the biggest discovery of its kind in Egypt and the Mediterranean. We're also speaking about the projects that are undergoing development, like the Northern Alexandria gas field, the West Delta gas field, the Borolus Atoll gas fields. So a wide range of projects actually. How are the upstream projects mostly financed in Egypt?
For upstream, I would say that the financing is dependent on the stage of development. So if we start by seismic exploration drilling up to development drilling, it's all equity. And it would probably remain so because the big oil majors can raise debt on their balance sheet at very low rates thanks to their high rating, and then finance these projects in countries like Egypt through their balance sheet. I do not expect that to change, and in fact, in terms of bank financing, I would even expect that bank financing in the upstream space would also continue to shrink. Walid was talking that in terms of reserve-based lending, that a lot of banks are pulling out from this business globally. So probably equity would have to fill that in. And the good message is that you're seeing new types of capital coming into this industry, like private equity, especially from the US. It's a trend that we have seen in Egypt over the past 2 years. Not just here, but also in other African countries with hydrocarbon base like Ghana, like Tunisia. I think private equity has a great role to play in that space. And on top of that, as you go down through the supply chain towards midstream and downstream, I think that the pool of liquidity and the available financing options get to be broader. You start looking at bond issuance and export credit, which is very popular now in Egypt, especially in the power and refining sector. Just to end up with an example, we are financing Midor refinery expansion through an export credit
The
facility.
second phase of the expansion works, right?
Yes, exactly. That is the larger expansion, which is costing $1.25 billion and would increase the refining capacity by around 60%. And that is thanks to an export credit facility that you can put in a downstream project, but more difficult to put in an upstream project. So you're getting more options as you go down the value chain.
Now, Heba, I think you've got something to say concerning the constraints facing the financing of the upstream projects in Egypt.
Well, I mean, in terms of upstream, Egyptian banks haven't really been involved, and I'm kind of, sort of satisfied and relieved to hear that international banks are shrinking away from reserve-based lending, because we've been sort of out of that business completely. We found it to be quite risky, and we don't have the appetite, the risk appetite to sort of go for that stage of the development. When you come to the midstream and downstream, Egyptian banks are extremely keen to be financing the projects, but what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the loan-to-deposit ratio in Egyptian banks in foreign currency has been quite high, so around 68%, and even Fitch in one of the recent reports are saying, well, that's still kind of high given the macroeconomic challenges still facing Egypt. So you get to Egyptian banks, you find that, for example, for Midor or for ERC refinery or for Tahrir Petrochemicals that's being implemented and spearheaded by Carbon Holdings, we've not been able to be very active on the financing side because the borrowers want to have, good long-term dollar loans at very competitive interest rates, and Egyptian banks just can't be in that space in terms of liquidity, in terms of tenors that they can provide lending, and in terms of the price and the cost of funding that we have. So we've been a little bit, as Egyptian banks, kind of a bit sidelined in the borrowing activity for the sector over the last period. I'm hoping that that's going to change with all the macroeconomic fundamentals that are kind of improving in Egypt towards the middle of next year. So
now, Yusuf, you were speaking about the Egyptian energy sector pre and post 2011. How did the international bank appetite change towards the oil and gas sector in Egypt pre-2011 and post that?
Look, I would say that Egypt in general has never faced a financing problem, even despite the political turmoil and the credit downgrades. International banks continue to finance energy in Egypt, but probably the structures have changed slightly. So before 2011, you'd see more international banks doing more loose working capital type of facilities, longer term. After 2011, you see a trend towards more structured project-based financing with sovereign guarantees. However, in terms of quantum, you have not really seen capital being withdrawn out of the country, but it's more of emerging financing structures that accommodate the different credit landscape of the country. And as the economic reform story improves and the country continues to regain credit rating upgrades and more international recognition of what is happening in the energy sector, you would see that the old financing structures coming back to Egypt.
I think just to add on that, I mean, we were very involved as CIB in financing sort of the LNG projects and also in the power sector, all the IPPs. And what we've seen is post the 2008 crisis, it's not just an Egypt thing, it's also the international banks are not really keen to come into Egypt on an uncovered basis. So what they want to do is come in under the umbrella of either the export credit agencies or in tandem with IFIs. So that is a major change that we've seen since 2008, maybe not 2011. And I think, as Yusuf is saying, if we get credit upgrades, then international banks can come back into that space. But for now, we're really dependent on ECA financing and IFIs. And those are the players that have played the major sort of role in financing all the projects that have happened in the recent years.
Now,
I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind when we talk about the viability of the petroleum sector is I think the institutions need viability. So I think we need credit-worthy state-owned institutions that are going to be off-takers as gas providers or suppliers. We need a distribution system that is fair and transparent. And I think the government is working in that direction, but as those steps come along, I think there'll be more financing opportunities because investors will be able to better understand the risks they're taking, and credit institutions like ourselves will be able to better figure out, what risks they're taking and how they can allocate them properly.
now, adding to that, Waleed, Yusuf, and Heba, we're speaking about the economic reforms program that Egypt has been embarking on.